Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. A hotel room at a Comfort Inn in Ballston, Virginia, is a place of profound anonymity. It is a sterile box of beige carpets, unremarkable art, and complimentary breakfast, designed for the transient salesperson or the family visiting relatives. It is a place utterly devoid of memory or meaning. But in the first week of January 2021, one of these rooms was transformed. It became an arsenal. Inside, the generic furniture was pushed aside to make way for the tools of a very different kind of business. There were hard-shell rifle cases, bins of ammunition, shotguns, and AR-15s. There were plate carriers, tactical vests, helmets, and radios. This was not a protest. This was a staging ground. This collection of weapons, just a 10-minute drive across the Potomac River from the United States Capitol, was known by its organizers as the QRF, the Quick Reaction Force. A few miles away, on January 6th, as a joint session of Congress convened to perform the sacred ceremonial duty of certifying a presidential election, a group of men and women moved through the chaotic mob with purpose. They were clad in camouflage, helmets, and armor, their hands on each other's shoulders, forming a human chain. They snaked through the crowd in a single-file tactical stack, a formation drilled into them through military and militia training. They were the Oath Keepers, and they were moving on the Capitol. What happened that day was a violent rupture in the American political fabric. But for the Department of Justice, the crime was not simply the broken glass or the breach of the doors. The true crime, they would argue, was a plot that had been simmering for months. It was a conspiracy hatched in encrypted chat rooms, fueled by a corrosive ideology, and given teeth by that arsenal waiting in the Virginia hotel. This case would force the American legal system to reach back over 150 years, to the ashes of the Civil War, to find a law powerful enough and controversial enough to confront a modern insurrection. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of that conspiracy. This is not just the story of a riot. It is the story of a plot. We will investigate the mind of its leader, the digital architecture of its planning, and the civil wera statute that would ultimately define the legal battle against domestic extremism in the 21st century. This is the anatomy of sedition. To understand the Oath Keepers, you must first understand their founder, Elmer Stewart Rhodes III. Rhodes is a man of profound, almost theatrical contradictions. He is a Yale Law School graduate, an alumnus of one of the most elite institutions in the world. He is also a self-styled militia leader who presents himself as a rough-and-tumble warrior. His physical appearance is part of his persona. He wears a distinctive black eye patch, the result of a firearms accident years ago. He often appears in tactical gear, speaking with a studied, gravelly intensity. Born in 1965, Rhodes enlisted in the Army after high school, becoming a paratrooper. A training accident left him with a severe back injury, leading to an honorable discharge. He would later work as a firearms instructor and a valet parker in Las Vegas, before a passion for libertarian politics led him, remarkably, to academia. He attended the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and then, in his late 30s, was accepted to Yale Law. This is a critical part of his identity. He wasn't just a disgruntled veteran, he was a constitutional scholar, or at least he positioned himself as one. He clerked for a prominent federal judge and worked for politicians. But the mainstream conservative and libertarian movements were not radical enough for him. He was animated by a deep-seated fear of federal government overreach, a belief that a tyrannical, new world order was perpetually on the brink of disarming and enslaving the American people. In 2009, in the nascent months of Barack Obama's presidency, Rhodes found his moment. He stood on the steps of the Battlefield Monument in Lexington, Massachusetts, a symbolic choice, and officially launched the Oath Keepers. The group's central premise was a stroke of marketing genius. It wasn't just another militia. It was a non-profit organization specifically targeting current and former military, law enforcement, and first responders. The name Oath Keepers itself was the core concept. Its members were people who had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Rhodes argued that this oath superseded any orders from superiors that they deemed unconstitutional. He published a list of 10 orders we will not obey. These included orders to disarm the American people, to impose martial law, or to force citizens into concentration camps. To the outside observer, these scenarios sounded like the plot of a dystopian action movie. To a growing segment of the populace, steeped in anti-government conspiracy theories, they sounded like an imminent threat. The Oath Keepers grew rapidly, establishing chapters across the country. They were not a clandestine cell. They were a public-facing 501c3 organization. They held meetings, ran training events, and most importantly, began showing up at moments of national tension. Their first major public appearance was at the Bundy Ranch standoff in Nevada in 2014. A rancher named Cliven Bundy was in a dispute with the Federal Bureau of Land Management over grazing fees, and federal agents moved to seize his cattle. Hundreds of armed militia members, including the Oath Keepers, descended on the ranch, creating a tense armed standoff. The federal agents, fearing a bloodbath, ultimately backed down. For Rhodes, this was a validation. Force, or the threat of it, had worked. The federal government had blinked. Later that same year, they appeared in Ferguson, Missouri, during the protests following the police killing of Michael Brown. But they didn't come as protesters. They arrived clad in tactical gear, carrying rifles, and positioned themselves on rooftops, claiming to be protecting private businesses. To local law enforcement and many in the community, they were not protectors. They was vigilantes, armed accelerants in an already explosive situation. This became their pattern for the next 6 years. Identify a flashpoint, insert themselves as a heavily armed security force, and feed their brand as the last line of defense between order and chaos. They appeared at protests in Louisville, Kentucky, Kenosha, Wisconsin, and dozens of other towns. All the while, Rhodes's rhetoric, delivered through open letters and online interviews, grew more and more apocalyptic. Then came the 2020 presidential election. For Stewart Rhodes, the defeat of Donald Trump was not a political loss. It was a coup. He immediately and fully embraced the false narrative that the election had been stolen. This was not just a grievance. It was the scenario he had been warning about for over a decade. The tyrannical government was finally making its move. The days and weeks following the election became a whirlwind of activity for the Oath Keepers. Rhodes began to position his organization as a private army loyal, not to the U.S. government as it stood, but to the man he still considered the rightful president. The digital record of this period would become the bedrock of the prosecution's case. The Oath Keepers, like many such groups, lived on encrypted messaging apps. Their primary platform was Signal. The group chats with names like DCOP, January 6/21 leadership and Friends of Stone became a real-time ledger of a developing conspiracy. On November 5, 2020, just 2 days after the election, Rhodes hosted a private go-to-meeting call with his leadership team. The call, which was secretly recorded by at least one participant, was later turned over to the FBI. On it, Rhodes's voice is calm, but his message is chilling. He tells his followers, "We're not getting out of this without a fight. There's going to be a fight, but let's just do it smart, and let's do it while we still can." He began issuing a series of open letters to President Trump. These letters were not private. They were published on the Oath Keepers website. They were a direct, public plea for the president to invoke the Insurrection Act, a rarely used 1807 law that allows the president to deploy the military for domestic law enforcement. Rhodes's plan was clear. He wanted Trump to declare a national emergency, nullify the election, and use the military to round up his political enemies. And in this scenario, the Oath Keepers would not be bystanders. Rhodes wrote, "We will also come and serve as a militia under your command, to defeat the domestic traitors and enemies." He was offering his organization as a paramilitary force to the sitting president to violently overturn an election. As the Stop the Steal movement gained momentum, the Oath Keepers provided security for high-profile figures at rallies in Washington, D.C. on November 14th and December 12, 2020. They guarded figures like Roger Stone and Ali Alexander. This was not just a side gig, it was a strategic move. It embedded them within the inner circle of the movement and gave them a sense of official purpose. Behind the scenes, the planning for January 6th, the day Congress would certify the Electoral College votes, was already in high gear. This was the deadline. This was the last stand. In the encrypted chats, the key lieutenants began to coordinate. We see the names that would later become central to the trial. Kelly Meggs, the leader of the Florida chapter; Jessica Watkins, a former Army Ranger who ran a bar in Ohio and led her own militia group, the Ohio State Regular Militia; and Thomas Caldwell, a retired Navy intelligence officer from Virginia. The chatter was not about a peaceful protest. It was about logistics for a military-style operation. Jessica Watkins messaged a recruit, "I need you fighting fit by inauguration. We are going to have a QRF. This is the real deal." The QRF, the Quick Reaction Force, was the element that elevated this from angry extremist rhetoric to a concrete prosecutable conspiracy. The idea was simple and chilling. Washington, D.C.'s gun laws are among the strictest in the nation. Carrying the rifles and heavy gear they owned would be impossible within the city limits. So, they would create an armed staging area outside the city. Thomas Caldwell, the Virginia local, was tasked with reconnaissance. He drove around the Virginia suburbs scouting hotels. He settled on the Comfort Inn in Ballston, Arlington. It was, as he noted in a message, a perfect location, with a metro station right there and quick access to the river. He even discussed ferrying the weapons across the Potomac in boats, like a modern-day crossing of the Delaware. The plan was for Oath Keeper members from states like North Carolina, Arizona, and Florida to drop their heavy weapons at this hotel armory. Before proceeding into D.C., the QRF team would stay with the weapons, monitoring communications, on standby. If Stewart Rhodes gave the word, or if, as they mused, all hell broke loose, the QRF would load the weapons into vehicles and drive them into the city to support the Oath Keepers on the ground. This was not a defensive plan. It was an offensive one. It was a cache of weapons held in reserve, waiting for a green light to prevent, hinder or delay the execution of U.S. law. As the date approached, the preparations intensified. Members were instructed to bring helmets, plates for body armor, mace and radios. They were told to obscure their identities, wiping their phones and leaving personal effects behind. On December 31, 2020, Stewart Rhodes posted another open letter. He was losing patience with Trump. He must act. If he does not, we will have to do it ourselves. We will have no choice but to walk in the path of the founders and fight to save our republic. In a Signal chat with his leadership team, Rhodes wrote that January 6th would be a hard constitutional deadline. He told them, "It will be a bloody and desperate fight. We are going to have a fight. That can't be avoided." On January 5th, the teams began to arrive. They checked into their hotels. The weapons were stashed at the Comfort Inn. That night, Rhodes, Meggs, Watkins, and others held a final in-person meeting in a hotel in D.C. The plan was set. On the morning of January 6, 2021, Stewart Rhodes did not go to the Ellipse to hear President Trump speak. He was not a mere protester swept up in the emotion of the crowd. He was a general, and he had established a command center. Rhodes spent most of the day at the Kimpton Hotel Monaco, just blocks from the Capitol. From there, he managed his encrypted chats, directing his assets on the ground. He was a VIP at the hotel, allegedly part of Roger Stone's security detail. As the crowd from the Ellipse began to march toward the Capitol, the Oath Keeper ground teams, who had been staged around the building, began to converge. At 2:25 p.m., just as the initial breach of the building was well underway, Kelly Meggs, the Florida leader, sent a message to the DC Op chat. "We are at the main dome, on the front steps, pushing." Then, at 2:38 p.m., the first stack formed on the east side of the Capitol. This was the moment captured on video, the one that would become the defining image of their operation. A group of about a dozen Oath Keepers, including Kelly Meggs, lined up single file, hands on each other's shoulders, and pushed their way through the massive crowd. They looked like a military unit, a disciplined wedge cutting through the chaos. They ascended the steps and entered the building through the East Rotunda doors, also known as the Columbus doors, which had been breached just minutes earlier. Inside, their movements were not random. They moved with purpose, past the overwhelmed Capitol police officers, toward the Senate side of the building. A second stack, this one including Jessica Watkins, formed up and entered through the same doors moments later. The audio from their Zello walkie-talkie app, captured by a data forensics expert, provides a chilling real-time narration of their intent. "We are in the main dome right now," Watkins is heard saying. "We are rocking it. We have a good group. We are in the lead. The fight is not over." Another voice crackles, "You are executing citizens' arrest. Arrest this election." Back at the Kimpton Hotel, Rhodes was monitoring the QRF chat. As news broke that Vice President Mike Pence had been evacuated, Rhodes wrote to his team at 2:25 p.m., "Pence is a traitor." He told the QRF team to stay frosty and watch for the signal. The signal never came. The QRF, the armed force in waiting, was never deployed. Why? It's a question that remains debated. Perhaps the D.C. Police and National Guard response, though delayed, was too robust. Perhaps the logistics of moving the weapons through a gridlocked, chaotic city were too difficult. Or perhaps Rhodes himself, the Yale lawyer, realized that activating the QRF would be the final, irrevocable step, turning his organization from a seditious cabal into an open, armed insurrection, a distinction he was not yet willing to cross. By 3 p.m., the stacks inside the Capitol were being pushed back by police deploying chemical spray. They retreated, exiting the building. But the conspiracy was not over. That evening, as the dust settled, Rhodes and his team were not remorseful. They were defiant. Rhodes gathered some of his followers for a dinner meeting at a P.F. Chang's restaurant in Virginia. He was still plotting. In the leadership signal chat, he wrote, "We're not done." He praised the rioters, calling them patriots entering their own Capitol building to protest a fraudulent election. He seemed to believe this was just the first battle of a longer war. In the days that followed, Rhodes continued to message his team. He told them to delete their messages about the D.C. operation. But it was too late. The digital breadcrumbs were everywhere. The FBI had already begun its investigation, and the Oath Keepers, with their high-profile, uniformed presence, were a primary target. The arrests began to roll out over the following year. First, the lower-level members, the ones easily identified in photos and videos. Jessica Watkins was arrested in mid-January 2021. Thomas Caldwell, the QRF planner, was arrested soon after. Kelly Meggs was arrested in February. But Stewart Rhodes remained free for nearly a year. He continued to give interviews, to fundraise, and to insist his organization had done nothing wrong. He claimed he was outside the Capitol, that he never instructed anyone to go in. He was insulating himself, a classic tactic of a conspiracy's leader. The investigation was complex, requiring the assembly of a mountain of digital evidence, cell phone location data, signal chats, Zello audio, travel receipts, and hotel bookings. The Department of Justice was not building a simple trespassing case. They were building something much bigger. On January 12, 2022, nearly a full year after the riot, the hammer fell. Stewart Rhodes was arrested in Texas, and the indictment unsealed by the Department of Justice contained a charge that stunned legal observers, a charge that had been almost dormant in the American legal system for decades. Stewart Rhodes and 10 of his co-conspirators were charged with seditious conspiracy. To understand the trial, you must first understand the law. The charge of seditious conspiracy is codified in Title 18, Section 2384 of the U.S. Code. It is not treason. Treason requires levying war against the United States or giving aid and comfort to its enemies, and it requires a very high burden of proof. Seditious conspiracy, by contrast, is a law about agreement. Passed in 1861, it was called the Conspiracy Act, and it was designed specifically to prosecute Confederate sympathizers in the North, who were plotting to undermine the Union war effort without technically levying war. The law makes it a crime for two or more people to conspire to overthrow, put down, or to destroy by force the government of the United States, or to oppose by force the authority thereof, or by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States. That last clause was the entire case. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Nessler, argued that the Oath Keepers had formed a conspiracy, an agreement, to use force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of a specific U.S. law, the Electoral Count Act, the law governing the certification of the presidential election. The trial of Stewart Rhodes, Kelly Meggs, Jessica Watkins, Thomas Caldwell, and another member, Kenneth Harrelson, began in September 2022. It was the most significant domestic terrorism trial in a generation. The prosecution's case was a methodical digital reconstruction of the plot. They did not need to prove that the Oath Keepers had a minute-by-minute plan to storm the Capitol. They only had to prove that they had agreed to use force to stop the certification, and that they had taken steps, known as overt acts, in furtherance of that agreement. The evidence was overwhelming, and it came almost entirely from the defendant's own words. The jury saw the signal chats. They read Rhodes's call for a bloody fight. They read Watkins's recruitment message about the QRF being the real deal. They read Caldwell's scouting messages about the Comfort Inn. The QRF was the prosecution's smoking gun. The prosecutor held up photos of the bins of ammo and the AR-15s. Why, he asked the jury, would a group planning a peaceful protest need a heavily armed quick reaction force waiting across the river? Why would they discuss ferries and body armor? This, he argued, was the proof of their intent to use force. The prosecution also had a powerful weapon: cooperating witnesses. Several Oath Keepers who had been indicted, including Graydon Young and Abdullah Rashid, pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against their former leader. They told the jury that the plan was indeed to stop the certification, by force if necessary. They described the paramilitary training, the sense of urgency, and the belief that they were starting a second American Revolution. The defense's strategy was difficult. They could not deny the messages. They could not deny the QRF. They could not deny that their clients were at the Capitol. So they had to argue about intent. The defense lawyers, and ultimately Stewart Rhodes himself, tried to frame their actions as defensive, not offensive. They argued that the Oath Keepers were there simply to provide security for speakers and to protect Trump supporters from Antifa, a group that had virtually no presence at the Capitol that day. The QRF, they argued, was a purely defensive measure. It was only to be used if Antifa attacked them with lethal force, or, and this was their key argument, if President Trump invoked the Insurrection Act. Rhodes's lawyers argued he was waiting for legal authority from the president to act. He wasn't conspiring against the government. He was preparing to act on behalf of what he saw as the legitimate government, Donald Trump, against a fraudulent one, the incoming Biden administration. Then, in a high-stakes gamble, Stewart Rhodes took the stand in his own defense. For 2 days, the Yale law graduate, clad in a suit, tried to explain away his own words. He was articulate, calm, and defiant. He testified that his rhetoric was just bluster. When he wrote about a bloody fight, it was just hyperbole, meant to motivate his members. He insisted over and over, there was no plan to storm the Capitol. He maintained that the stack formation was not a tactical maneuver to breach the building. It was a safety measure to navigate the dense, chaotic crowd without getting separated. He compared it to a conga line, or what a kindergarten teacher might do on a field trip. This was the core of his defense. There was no explicit order from him to enter the building. He argued that Meigs and Watkins, who led the stacks, had gone off mission. He was just a logistics guy that day, he claimed, managing security teams from his hotel room. The cross-examination by the prosecution was devastating. Prosecutor Nessler simply read Rhodes's own messages back to him, one by one. When you wrote, "He must act, or we will have to do it ourselves," that was just bluster? When you wrote, "We are going to have a fight," that can't be avoided, you were just LARPing, or live-action role-playing, was a term the defense used repeatedly. When your team stored rifles, ammunition, and night vision goggles in a hotel room, that was for a peaceful event? Rhodes grew flustered. He argued semantics. He attacked the prosecution. But the digital record was immutable. His own words, captured in thousands of messages, contradicted his testimony at every turn. He had claimed to be a constitutional scholar, but the prosecution painted him as a violent extremist who wrapped his intentions in legalistic language. He tried to portray himself as a leader who had lost control of his followers, but the prosecution showed he was the one who had wound them up, pointed them at the Capitol, and staged an arsenal nearby to back them up. The jury was left to decide. Was Stewart Rhodes a LARPer whose rhetoric got out of hand, or was he the leader of a calculated conspiracy to use force to stop the transfer of power? On November 29, 2022, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. It was a split, but a decisive victory for the prosecution. Elmer Stewart Rhodes III, guilty of seditious conspiracy. Kelly Meggs, guilty of seditious conspiracy. The jury had agreed that the two leaders, the founder and the head of the Florida chapter, had indeed entered into a conspiracy to use force to oppose the U.S. government. The other three defendants, Jessica Watkins, Thomas Caldwell, and Kenneth Harrelson, were acquitted of the seditious conspiracy charge. The jury, in this nuanced verdict, seemed to draw a line between the top-level leadership who orchestrated the plot and the subordinates who executed parts of it. However, all 5 defendants, including those acquitted of sedition, were found guilty of other grave felonies, including obstruction of an official proceeding and conspiracy to obstruct the certification. The sentencing hearing in May 2023 was the final act. U.S. District Judge Amit Mehta, who presided over the trial, delivered a scathing assessment. He rejected every argument that Rhodes had made. "What we absolutely positively cannot have," Judge Mehta said, "is a group of citizens who are prepared to take up arms in order to bend the government to their will." He directly addressed Rhodes, who stood before him, still defiant. "You are not a political prisoner," Mehta said. "You were the one who gave the order. You were the one who created the QRF." Then, Judge Mehta made a finding that would reverberate through all the January 6 cases. He applied a terrorism enhancement to Rhodes's sentence, a legal designation that significantly increases the prison term. He found that the Oath Keeper's actions were calculated to influence or affect the conduct of government by intimidation or coercion, the legal definition of domestic terrorism. A seditious conspiracy, Judge Mehta concluded, when you take those two words and you put them together, is among the most serious crimes an American can commit. He sentenced Elmer Stewart Rhodes III to 18 years in federal prison, the longest sentence handed down to any January 6 defendant at that time. Kelly Meggs received 12 years. Jessica Watkins, though acquitted of sedition, received 8.5 years for her role. So what is the unique anatomy of this crime? It is the anatomy of modern sedition. The Oath Keeper's case was not about a single violent act. It was about a sprawling, decentralized agreement, a conspiracy of the mind, as prosecutors called it, that was given form and structure through encrypted apps and online rhetoric. The crime scene was not just the U.S. Capitol, it was the Signal chat logs, the Zello audio files, and the GoToMeeting recordings. The case presented a unique challenge. How does the legal system confront a group that cloaks its violent intentions in the language of patriotism and constitutional law? The Oath Keepers didn't see themselves as traitors. They believed they were the true patriots, saving the nation from a deep state coup. The Department of Justice's decision to use the seditious conspiracy statute was a profound risk. The law was archaic, rarely used, and politically loaded. The last time it had been successfully used in a major case was in 1995 against the Islamist militants who plotted the Day of Terror bombings in New York. A failed prosecution could have been seen as a massive overreach, potentially validating the defendants' claims of persecution. But the convictions of Rhodes and Meggs established a powerful legal precedent. It affirmed that the agreement to use force against the government is, itself, a completed crime. It proved that a leader cannot insulate himself from an insurrection by staying in a hotel room, and that a quick reaction force, staged for violence, is not bluster. It is an overt act in furtherance of a conspiracy. The trial of Stewart Rhodes and the Oath Keepers ultimately serves as a stark legal landmark, proving that a 19th-century law still has the power to hold 21st-century insurrectionists accountable, and that the line between extremist rhetoric and a seditious conspiracy is crossed the moment preparations for war are made against one's own government. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.